So first up, I guess we're all here for most of the same reasons with respect to there's an urgency to restore degraded and damaged landscapes. And it's important that we sort of acknowledge that the Australian government's committed significant investments into that over the last 25 odd years. It's also interesting that we're here with the beginnings of the UN decade. Did that just die out? Oh, am I loud enough? Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Good, thank you, Phoebe. So it's, I think Bruce Clarkson as well this morning in the address was, it's important that we sort of make the most of the UN decade on restoration. And I think it's important that we put that into a context as well. So most recently for the Australian Commonwealth Government, the RLP has been its main project. It's the flagship for federal government investment. It's funded over a 5-year period to about 450 million Australian dollars. There's 200 projects across the RLP system, and they occur across 54 management units. It's interesting because it occurs right across Australia, so you're breaking down jurisdictional boundaries and you're looking at interventions that can help to restore landscapes. The RLP project also, it concentrates on priorities that have been put forward by the government, generally around the EPBC Act, and those priority areas fall roughly into 4 areas. Ramsar wetlands and trying to reduce invasive species, threatened species, World Heritage Sites, and also nationally threatened ecological species. So one of the aspects of past experience with the RLP, but previous projects like Caring for Country, etc., that have contributed potentially about $7.4 billion investment over the last quarter of a century, is that often the reporting has been about activities, fencing, revegetation, pest and weed control, and not so much about the outcomes like species recovery. There's movement towards that, change of funding model as well, from going from grants to procurement. And there's also, in some respects, been a lack of consistent baseline data that's transferable across projects and learning and being able to use that for adaptive management. Also, the data storage has sometimes been quite disparate. So the government looked at working towards a more strategic approach of dealing with some of these. And last year, the long-term monitoring framework came out, which was developing a way of looking at the LPP programs across all of Australia and trying to deal with some of those issues I just spoke to. It's aiming for more effective monitoring and robust data collection across the RLP. It also puts forward and prescribes a structure of data generation and management, and being able to access and extrapolate that data into meaningful management decisions. Which brings us into what I came to talk about, and it's that idea of a monitoring, evaluation and research network that sort of happens at the nexus of science, policy and practice, where the RLP is an approach that's federally funded across all of Australia, looking at common priorities. And the federal government has enlisted the people that I work with at Turn for their training and monitoring expertise, and also using the exemplar research capacity of the CSIRO to help roll out this MER network. So the MER network and the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research Network is question focused. It will look at some priorities around things that maybe aren't working so well or aren't being so effective, or are they important at a topical time within the restoration programs. It's also going to be embedded. So within these projects, the 200 odd projects, we'll be embedding those questions into it in a robust way that's got a scientific perspective with controls and treatments. Networked as well from a perspective of other networks in ecological systems, for instance, the tree diversity network and nutrient network. The capacity to do that across different, restoration in particular, is so context dependent, the capacity to roll networks out across different systems gives you the ability then to do a lot more inference than you could from just a topical treatment, a topical experiment. So this is a 3-year pilot, and we've just gone through the last 6 months of scoping the project with the practitioners and within our program and engaging with particular stakeholders. It's going to involve the collaboration, as I said, between CSIRO and the Department of Agriculture and TERN, and we'll be utilising this as a pilot methodology towards a greater and more mechanistic approach to particular issues that might arise, or particular priorities that might arise from the RLP project and the funding and the investment. It will be embedded nationally, and we're now in the point of stratifying and implementing some of the project bases. So from the perspective of this early stage, the last 6 months, we've been scoping and looking at the aims of the project. And we focused on 2 particular aspects of restoration interventions. And this really came about from the 2019-2020 fires, which had catastrophic effects, especially across the Mediterranean sort of biome at the south and also up the east coast. And so we looked at the perspective of fire and weeds as 2 main foci for the network. And we looked at how the aim of the network to improve local and national scale understanding of these particular foci. The second part of the scoping exercise was to invite the group of the RLP practitioners and also experts in these areas of ecology to contribute to some of the structure of how we'd ask these questions, how we'd roll it out, the logistics of doing this type of network across a national scale, and got a lot of really interesting feedback that helped us to design the actual experimentation. We also reviewed the current data that's on the with the federal government that's been lodged within its merit system, which manages most of these RLP in past and present, and had a look at how that's been done. And we wanted to do that so that we can incorporate and integrate a MER network design into what's current there, some of the baseline, whether or not it's going to be able to talk to each other. And it also helps us to stratify and select the sites. I might have missed one there, sorry. So yes, basically we did a full data review, which was run by the CSIRO. So coming into this second part of 2021, we came up with an experimental design which looks at those foci that I talked about, being with respect to burn and also unburnt and also the weed, and came up in this triplet design. So we've now engaged with 17 or 20 odd service providers across the country that have been affected by fire, and looking at stratifying these sites across their landscape. It looked like something like this, just from a sort of schema of how this goes. And as you can imagine, trying to fit this in at a landscape scale means a lot of interviews, a lot of talks, a lot of going out to site and trying to involve that. We've also come up with initial monitoring protocols that are loosely based on most of the TERN monitoring methodology that's been proven over the last decade, and will include species richness, point intercept, basal wedge, also some of the soil metagenomic and biophysical parameters. And lastly, we sort of looked at the representation of RLP across the landscape. And as I said before, like most of that's taken up with the environment, those 4 criteria that I was talking about. There's also agriculture makes up about 25% of the RLP funding. And then superimposed fire from the actually goes back a little bit further than that, but fire and weed aspects of these projects that are being used in and around, and to help identify where we'd put these sites. So coming into the end of 2021 and into 2022, we've developed some training protocols, which will be incorporated into the network, and also helping to empower some of the RLP providers by how the metadata collection will be incorporated, and also a full understanding of why the MER network is important to helping to work towards adaptive management within this framework. We've also developed some data collection app work that runs off the background of what we're currently using with Turn, but it would specifically be used for this project. How are we going for time? And also some additional monitoring support, which will come in the form of training and on-site project planning. So the last of that would deal with how we aggregate and evaluate the data with the existing data that is there and what we actually will be collecting as well. I'll just, Suzanne Prober, who's leading this project, will be talking a little bit more about some of the modelling that will be done into the future. It's later today, I think, one of the afternoon sessions. It's also important some of the government priorities that have been asked for are accounted for in the project. So just finally, getting to the point of our network, I guess from the status quo, if you take into account environmental change, some of these interventions are not being as effective on a yearly basis if you're just continually beating your head against the wall. If you remove environmental change, then potentially they're in stasis. Research policy uptake can be reasonably slow and not as fast and effective as it could be. We're hoping with this ideal of incorporating the information from the MER network, you get iterative responses that will help to improve the interventions and give you the capacity to improve the restoration in general. So just finishing up, there's a few links there I've got with respect to the project, who's involved. I can give anybody that in the future. My good colleagues at Turn, a little bit of what we do and how we do it, which I'll talk a little bit more later, and some acknowledgements from Turn. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Nick. Does anyone have any questions, either online or in the room? I'll be monitoring online. If you have a question, you can type it in there.
Nick, most of this that you talked about was sort of more in the terrestrial and fire and weeds. Can you just speak just a little bit about what's going on in your estuarine settings, particularly around Ramsar?
Yeah, so this is particularly focused on fire and weeds, and it's been called a pilot network. So in the future, we hope to have this same model and framework running out to other types of environments and habitats as well. But this specifically was, I guess, the opportunity, if it's a terrible word for it, because it was a terrible tragedy with respect to the bushfires, was seen and as a best way of piloting this framework. So I guess the best way of saying it is there's a couple of workshops that I've included in the recordings, and this is spoken to quite in depth by the department. We hope to use this as a way of springboarding into new methodologies to help get the most efficacious interventions across different habitats as well in future RLP. Yep.
Hello.
Oh.
Sorry. Great talk.
Thank you.
Given the focus on weeds and fire, and I commend the focus on seeking to understand the actual native biodiversity responses to that threat-focused management. Your design doesn't include looking at the direct effects of weed management itself, only in interaction with fire.
Yes. So, and it's, I mean, ideally it would be a fully factorial design. So this is blocked and it's quasi good pickup. Fire is the driver that we're predominantly looking at from a model perspective, and the weeds are a component of that effect. So, for instance, the people that I work with at Turn visited Kangaroong post-fire in 2019, 2020, and they brought up some amazing data. So we have 1 hectare plots where every plant is sampled across that plot. We have genetic vouchers, we have plant vouchers, we have soil samples. And so just picking up some of these early establishing weed species, but within the context of how that sits with the fire, is probably more towards the aim of what that first tier is, what we're looking for. Yeah. But again, I must stress, because the way this has been done, it's as you can imagine, it's quite logistically challenging, and trying to make sure that we have good buy-in from the people that can really help with this. We can't cover every aspect on this original pilot. We're trying to do the best we can with the original pilot. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. I feel like I'm doing a plenary at the moment. It's a bit of, I'm an old man as well, so I'm not sure if I've got the endurance anymore. All of my acknowledgements earlier, I'll stress the context and the context of the welcome that Auntie B gave us. I feel very blessed to have been experiencing that, and also for the organisers and the sponsors making this possible. Incredibly grateful to be here. The second of my talks today is an extension of where I've just spoken about, and talks more about the capacity of the people that I work with and how that may fit into a restoration context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the UN Decade on Restoration, which was obviously the focus of many of the talks that will be here, and also into SER, which is coming up in a month. It's an important opportunity for us as people that work in this field to look at the way that we leverage and also collate the information that can help the practices become the best they can. Also talk about some of the aspects of the data and the collections we have at Turn, that how they may be available, how they are available, but how they may be used within the restoration practice more broadly. Giving some context about who we collaborate with and what we've done in the past, where we might go into the future as well, and maybe a broader perspective of the type of data and how that may be helpful for some of your practices, your research, and also your collaborations and partnerships. So I guess from the perspective of the UN Decade in Restoration and the past few years, restoration being only 50 odd years old, we've been working quite diligently to try to restore landscapes that are degraded, and large aspirational goals have been set to try to achieve some of the ecological restoration we're asking for. This sort of consolidated and coalesced into a movement and an idea by the UN trying to get some momentum in the policy within, and also within the restoration sector. Yes, so it's coalesced into the UN wanting to build political momentum, I suppose. And again, we had a nice touch on that from an urban perspective and also from a practical perspective this morning. It's also important to realise that there's some key priorities within this area. It's to protect the biodiversity, look at aspects and fight against climate change, enhance food security, and provide clean water. I recommend this editorial that came out late last year, which was put together by both Bruce and Team McDonald, both very, very important people within the restoration community of Australia and Australasia. It gives a good focus on what our historical perspective has been, where this sits within, and where funding's been, and also where this sits within the concept of how the next 10 years may play out from a restoration perspective. So one of the key things about restoration and how it's been going, I touched on it in the last talk as well, is coming up with some metrics of the efficacy of what we do, and what's working, what's not working. This was a really interesting meta-analysis study that was done by Renato Chrysolais back in 2016. It looked across the landscapes that were the majority of where the restoration was being done, and considered restoration, how it enhances biodiversity, and looking at changes in vegetation structure as some of the metrics for how we decide what effectiveness is. And obviously there's a big span in those numbers that is telling us that restoration occurs across a spectrum, something we have to understand. There are many, many factors moving into that. It's not full recovery and biodiversity and vegetation structure. There's still some really big key gaps that remain in those practices, and they do to this day. And if we don't really account for them properly across the next decade, it's going to make some of the investment that's going to be put into restoration not achieve its full potential. So another aspect of what's one of the gaps is in driving the lack of restoration success is that baseline data, which we reference things, especially in sort of fragmented landscapes, and which are many of the landscapes where we work. That data can be spatially and temporally, even methodologically variable. So it then becomes really difficult to synthesize that before you have interventions. Which brings us to what we do here at Turn. 10 years ago, Turn was put forward as a way of dealing with how we track change on a continental scale. So you needed to have a method that was standardized and would be rolled out across the landscape, agreed by ecologists. And this process was obviously had to go through a lot of workshopping and a lot of evolution before it became accepted. But now we've got to the point where there's 800 plots across Australia, and they're included in all the major biomes. They're 1 hectare plots with full information about cover abundance, genetic material, soil metagenomic material, and it's the most intensive sampling strategy from an ecological perspective that we've certainly seen in Australia. This is where the plot sits. And from a restoration perspective, that's pretty handy, especially if you're looking at reference communities. It occurs in and around those areas where investments are. It also has the benefit of having several transects across environmental gradients. Now, these are really important tools for people that are considering what's happening to landscape because of climate change. It gives you an indication as to what across that gradient is being affected. Is there problems with local adaptation, genetic diversity, has fragmentation affected the capacity for these populations to survive? We can help to get some of that information from the data and the collections that we have at Turn. So yeah, just to I guess expand on that a little, is these the methods that we have been standardised. We're still working through, the current teams are across in Queensland. We're running 2 teams at the present, across in Queensland, and they'll be back up here in the Northern Territory in a couple of weeks. And we look at florestics, cover abundance, the site photographs. This is all accessible to you as researchers, and you should make the most of it. In the restoration context, it's powerful stuff. If you ever imagined how much time and energy it would cost to go out and collect these samples, then it's very hard to try to do that again into the future. So once again, you know, we cover these major areas of the communities that have been restored, where energy is going into and resources are going into to restore them. And there's lots of baseline information that really helps with the aspects of the reference community and how that sits within the restoration context. Just a few more of the places that we go to. By the way, our Turn do take volunteers from time to time if anybody's looking for some good science field work. You get to some of the savannas and alpine areas and a number of wonderful places. So expanding on that a little bit, the way the data is compiled in Turn and is also stored, you get some insight about the way that you plant, the interventions and how they're doing, how you go about it from a logistic perspective. Often because of time and resources and funding cycles, plants might be direct seeded in rows, etc. But there's some basis to the fact that some of the spatial separation can impinge on the effectiveness of the restoration. So considering this from a perspective in a natural biome, this could be really helpful if you have the time and energy to sort of look at how these happen on the land, how recruitment and other spatial aggregation and dispersal mechanisms occur. If that can be imparted, there's a fairly good chance it's going to have positive effects on your restoration. A little bit, I guess it's a little bit more expanded, and I'm probably going to run out of time. So it's how much I got? 5. All right. So once again, the data that TERN collects, it's yours, it's out there, it's a piece of national infrastructure, it's accessible, and it should be accessible. If it's not, tell us, we want to know that. It can help you to look at what species to plant, where to plant them, looking at different aspects of maybe community compensation and structure, and how that structure should be looking in the future, not just at one point in time, but during an age stagger of a restoration project. It can also help you to set densities about planting and key species, measuring success by using not just a straightforward, yes, it's along a live tree in a paddock, but maybe looking at aspects of recruitment and microbial diversity. I did quite a bit of work in my PhD on that, and it was helped by the stuff that is collected and collated by TERN. So accessing these TERN data sets, we just recently come out with a CRAN package for AusPlotsR, which helps you to navigate these our data sets with much clarity. There's also a data discovery portal, which gives you a whole lot of other options about the greater extent of what TERN collects and how we do that. It's also, we've got these biophysical samples, which helps potentially if you're looking at genetic provenance and other aspects of that. 50,000 plant genetic samples, 40,000 voucher samples, I think about 28,000 soil samples and metagenomic samples. They're all there at your disposal with the metadata, with all of that contextual information that can help you to get more bang for your buck out of the restoration process. Just a quick talk about some collaborations we have. We have many collaborations right around the world from an ecological perspective, but also a strong connection with bush heritage. They're an independent not-for-profit, which you're probably all aware of. Also developed this priority landscape model quite recently that gives an idea of the key areas where they're conservation across Australia, especially with working with partnerships with Aboriginal groups. TERN currently has 12 reserves that we have our sites and our methodology rolled out on, and they're going into the way that, thanks mate, they're going into the way that bush heritage is looking at their conservation management, also trying to improve the management decision making and demonstrate conservation impact, which is really important to the stakeholders. One last, I guess this is maybe food for thought, is in so much that this has been very national focused, but I think we've got a broader global perspective, especially in the UN decade of restoration. So TERN has sampled right through the southwest bioregion across the Mediterranean biome of South Australia, which is, there's those heat maps there. This was a paper by Klasmer and Shaw from 2009 that models some likely points of the Mediterranean biome that were going to be affected into the future. And my point is that there's climate analogues across the world that are in this area, and we have a lot of background data. They've been affected by increased frequency of extreme weather events, fire. They've got similar types of vegetation functional community as well. I think there's a lot of synergies that are yet to be explored in this area. And so TERN and restoration, I think they should be much closer links there. We're here to serve the ecological community, but also I think it's the capacity for TERN to help inform and make practices more effective as yet to be completely understood. And I think that's the end of my, yes it is. Through the second one. Thank you. There's a bit of a rush towards the end. I'm sorry, but I can go back and tell you more.
We have 5 minutes to explore anything we might have missed.
Nice to meet you, Nick. Andrew Harford.
Oh,
we're going to catch up, right? And my broad question for you. Great talk, by the way. Really good to learn about churn. And though I really very much advocate and appreciate the need for standard practices, 10 years after, they can be a bit of a shackle, right? Sometimes technology moves on, the best techniques develop. So is there a process for reviewing those standard practices, updating them, and making them better as they go along?
That's a very fair question. Thank you very much. So one of the other collaborations we're currently looking at is with the Department of Ag again, and looking at standard practices for monitoring. That's going to be, it's also included in that is quality assurance and looking at the method in entirety. As for that capacity for change, the most important thing is that our data can speak to previous data down through there. It's the only way that we can pick up change in a meaningful way. So that's really a question for the data scientists to make sure that we're still collecting the same data through time. Hello.
This is a very practical question, but there are an extraordinary number of samples, reference samples that you have. Where are they all housed?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't quite get to talk more to, which I would have liked to, I guess I was trying to stress the fact that they're there. So what happens when if we go to a site across any part of the country, is that each species at that site are vouchered ready for herbaria of the area that we're taking in. So for instance, if it's here, it goes to Canberra or it goes to one of the other states. We also have additional vouchered specimens, and sometimes the herbaria already have good samples of that. So everything that is in either addition or hasn't been ascensioned, that comes to Adelaide. So it goes to the Adelaide, and that's curated by people that actually collect it as well. So it's fully, you can put in I think the next slide tells you about actually asking for those samples. But that's also with all the soil metagenomic sample. The additional soil that doesn't go to the CSIRO soil archive is also in Adelaide, which is actually we're having a purpose-built facility for all of this archiving, and in many respects, Turner's becoming a bit of a museum for this information, a library for data and genetic material. We also have all the plant genetic material is also under controlled conditions in Adelaide. And once again, it's accessible by anybody that really wants it. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixture, but the vast majority, when you take into account where we've been, is all kept, sampled and curated in South Australia.
Having been in the game of rehabilitation, I don't say restoration, because you cannot ever bring it back 100%. There is much more complexity than just knowing a soil or a plant. Each plant has different biodiversity associations when you design a landscape for biodiversity. Now, how does Turn look at that complexity?
So one of the conditions of being an NCRIS facility is that we actually don't do our own research. We collect the data and we put it in a capacity for other researchers. It's a national infrastructure. It's actually part of the Department of Education. So we collect it in a robust scientific manner, and it's up to these brilliant people in the room to go about looking at how it fits into a larger project. I hope I didn't bore you too much with two back-to-back, but I really appreciate you being here and putting up with me. Look forward to the rest of the conference and seeing some of the other faces in the room putting some presentations in. Thank you very much.